and thank you for joining this Talent Minders podcast. My name is Andrew Zach, Talent Minders principal consultant and founder, and I'm happy to have an international leadership development and personal growth thought leader and expert with me on the podcast this week. JohnnieMoore is a facilitator based in Cambridge, the United Kingdom. He has worked around the world helping organizations have meetings that are more creative and avoid death by PowerPoint. We all experience that in our meetings wherever we are. He is the founder of JohnnieMoore Consulting, a consultancy that helps us to work more effectively and creatively in an always-on world, as he describes it. His first job was as a speechwriter to English parliamentarian Lord Sainsbury, which is interesting, before working in advertising. He later changed careers to facilitation. Johnnie has worked with organizations across the world, including the BBC, Fitch Design, NPR, the Commonwealth Secretariat, Johnson & Johnson, Save the Children, Amnesty International, to name a few. He's a visiting tutor at the Said Business School at Oxford University and author of the great book, Unhurried at Work, available at Amazon.com. Today, Johnnie is going to share his thinking about leadership, purpose, and the need for businesses to define their reason for being, purpose, and humanity during COVID-19 and beyond. So welcome, Johnnie, and let's get started. And Johnnie, maybe a good place to start. Could you give a brief introduction of your background and expertise and your fabulous company, JohnnieMoore Consulting?
Thank you, Andrew. I haven't had my company described as fabulous in quite a while, so that's very encouraging.
Well, it should be.
Where to begin? I mean, I suppose my first grown-up job was I spent a year working as a speechwriter for Lord Sainsbury, who was a sort of supermarket magnate here in the UK. But I think I always wanted to do something more creative. So I then became a copywriter and then a planner in advertising, which I did for 15 or 20 years. And then by a series of sort of accidents, really, I changed career to being a facilitator, which is what I've done for the last 20 years, which has, been quite lucky. I've had the chance to work in all sorts of different parts of the planet. So obviously a fair amount of my work where I live in the UK, but I've also traveled a bit. So I've worked in as far afield as Malawi and the Solomon Islands and Singapore and a lot of much less glamorous sounding places. So I guess for that time, I've just been super interested in what makes groups of people work well together, what stops them working well together. And then a few years ago, I started as a kind of side project, a thing I call Unhurried. I mean, maybe I can talk more about the origins of it later, but it's essentially a practice of holding conversations where people use a very simple object, the equivalent of a talking stick, only I go for an everyday object. So whatever comes to hand, like a marker pen or something, uses it to signal that they're taking a turn and to enforce within a group conversation, a very simple practice of not interrupting each other and letting the speaker decide when they're finished. And only at that point, when they put their object down, does somebody else take a turn. And that has that not necessarily that specific process, but that idea, that spirit of Unhurried has gradually sort of infused, or you could say infected, more and more of my work with people and groups.
I love that. I love that. That is, now I had the pleasure of working with you. I was actually a client, and I experienced some of this. Sounds very easy, but it's harder than it looks. And it is powerfully effective, isn't it? It really is.
I do apologize. I'm going to silence this interruption that we're getting from my phone. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you. It was quite an adventure, as you recall. It involved me flying to Kuwait from Australia, which was not, in some ways, not a sensible way to go about things, but it did create, the whole thing became a massive adventure for me.
Yeah, and for us. Yeah, super.
And
super.
I think working with your team was a reminder, as I am so often reminded, is that, you go into work, people are used to playing conventional roles, but just below the surface of their conventional roles and their conventional and in some cases not terribly helpful behavior, is a real thriving live human being with passions and interests and capacities, which, sometimes by working more playfully, you begin to uncover, I guess I would put it, ways that we can connect at team members at levels other than the official one. And when you do it right, that actually creates lots of energy for the official one as well.
Yeah, and it's almost like what I remember vividly was once you gave the group, including me, quite frankly, as the team lead, permission to do that, we embraced it. We ran toward it. We enjoyed it. We became ourselves, and I think we became more productive as a result, more creative. The ideas became stronger. We had more fun. I think we walked away from that experience really touched, because we really got to know each other. We really did some good, fun, powerful work because we were so authentic, and you helped us get to that level of truism, authenticity, which is so often difficult to get to in organizations today. Which I think is, plays nicely to what we're trying to talk about today. I think the role of organizations, how we lead these organizations, we've been talking about it for some years, but I think since COVID is accelerating in terms of the changes, and maybe it's the Gen Z that's driving it. I mean, because they're making their themselves quite well understood that they do expect some change, and I think CEOs and senior leaders are starting to respond to, hey, we need to create a different level of culture and work environment, work practice to get to a higher level of engagement and a different level of customer experience, and therefore loyalty, and that could make a huge difference from a competitive perspective. So that's really cool. There's one, if I may just refer to a Harris poll that came out recently, that 80% of respondents, during this COVID period, said that they would remember which companies did the right thing by their workers in dealing with safety measures or efforts to avoid the layoffs. And 3/4 said they wouldn't forget those businesses that took missteps along the way, long after the crisis. So there's clearly a growing shift in what employees and societies expect from organizations and companies in terms of their responsibilities, their ultimate purpose, and how they create environments that people can excel in. Can you explain this growing shift toward a more human business model? And I would say particularly among this Gen Z that we refer to.
I was thinking, I couldn't quite call to mind, there's a very famous adage, isn't there, about you really find out what people's values are when they're under stress, when they're under pressure, when things go wrong. We can all sort of do the right behaviors when things are well, but it's when we're hit with adversity that we find out what we're made of. And that's what I think that Harris poll reflects. The organizations that kind of instinctively, can I use that word? I think I can, did the right thing. That creates a searing memory for people, one that I don't think goes away. And hoping that I hope we're right, that there is an increasing trend to being more human. I think that the COVID will have contributed to that for people, because I think we've all of us who've been in lockdown have had a bit of chance to reflect a bit more deeply on our lives and what is satisfying. We've got a different idea of what essential means in a world where, we realize, I remember in the early days of this being really struck by the people who would deliver food, these underpaid essential workers who were working through, when we thought it was dangerous even to be out, really brought home to me that the inequalities of the way we're working at the moment and the absurdity of it. So I think that surely has given a kickstart to a lot of people to think a bit differently about, humanizing. No, we all like to talk about humanizing, but the actual work of humanizing is more challenging. And how do we get more out of these extraordinary biological intelligence we call our fellow workers. I think something that the Unhurried Project has really brought home to me through doing hundreds of these conversations now, sometimes with people from all sorts of different places on the planet, is to realize that when you really listen, every single human being is a very intelligent person trying to make sense of a difficult world, and they're all rather talented and they all have powerful imaginations. And I think that beautiful truth gets easily lost if we operate within, the confines of a corporate hierarchy. And I guess you were very kind about when we work together, and that's when being playful seemed to work, because sometimes it doesn't always work, but when it does work, I think it reveals to us that our colleagues are these flesh and blood creatures with these amazingly different experiences and talents and unexpected capacities. And when we're alive to that, then I think our sense of what our potential as a team is brought to life in a way that the manuals and the best practices books just can't even begin to point to.
So it's interesting how some of these leadership cultures will, during the COVID period, they've reacted so differently. I mean, in some cases, you've seen some organizations that have said, of course, you're not going to be in the office. It's a safety issue, and we're going to make sure that everyone has the best tools so that we can communicate and collaborate. Maybe we have some manager training to help not only on the technology, but on sort of the psychological and sort of the behaviors, some of the softer skills around how to manage remotely and manage stress associated with that. Maybe you've got, greater investments in, childcare associated with those companies, particularly for single parents. And even to the point where, some companies have committed to not having a layoff. During this period, we are not laying off any staff. So really just drawing that line in the sand and commitment, because, this is bigger than the balance sheet. And we're not going to just tear this organization apart because we may have a reduced level of profitability in the short term. And you've got sort of another sort of organizational leadership culture, which is just the opposite, and I won't name any companies, but you're coming to work. You're going to come to work. We're going to put a plastic shield between you. It's about a foot tall, when we know it's not going to be really effective, but we'll put it up anyway. We expect you to perform exactly as you were before, and without any sort of added support at all. What's going on there? Do you think what drives an organization to take a more purposeful, humanistic approach versus the other, in your experience?
It's really hard to know for sure, because I think these cultures grow over time and they grow organically, don't they? And many leaders will know how hard it is to change an organization's culture, because it's not created in an instant and in a single deliberate act by a visionary or unvisionary leader. They grow and they repeat themselves over time, and all of those performances, if you will, of beautiful and ugly leadership, if we can use that those have been built over time by an accretion of stories and incidents.
You think it's related as well to courage? I mean, if you are in a leadership position at any time, but let's take the pandemic as one exceptional time, is having the courage to step up and make these hard decisions and actually play the role that you're supposed to play.
I think in a way, I think that's yes. I think I do agree with that, but I think it's sometimes we make courage into this big thing that might feel beyond our reach. But I think it's made up of thousands of tiny little acts of courage, and I suspect that to connect humanly, it really helps to be in that place of being slightly fearful. And I'll illustrate this with a really simple personal story, which is last Sunday, about a week ago, I decided to go and do an online improv workshop. I love improv theatre, and I've done this kind of work before, but I hadn't done it recently. Mm-hmm. And on a whim, really, I joined this 2-hour online musical improv class. Mm-hmm. And musical improv, essentially in this class, someone plays a piano, a keyboard, and you have to perform in song. So it's a stretch, and it's even more of a stretch online than it is in person. And I went along with this bunch of very good-willed people, but you would have to do stuff like, at one point, with no preparation at all, I was told, you're going to sing a song, you're going to sing, Johnnie, you're going to sing the verse, this other person's going to sing the chorus, and we're going to give you a theme, and you're going to start singing. And part of my brain is going, I can't do this. Well, I've got nothing. And your subject is, I don't know, to take an example from the workshop, some people had to sing a song where you just had to sing a list of objects, and you were given the list. So you might be given vegetables and you'd have to sing, oh, broccoli and apples and cauliflower. And I've broken it straight away. I've gone for a fruit, right? Such is the nature of this process. And this, when you do improv, when I do improv, I often have this experience of, why have I done this? I have got nothing, but I have to sing anyway. So you have to give, and you start and you give a performance with whatever you've got. And it's not necessarily very good, but what you realize is that in giving your not necessarily very good technical performance, you're creating this atmosphere in the room, which is generally rather joyful and mirthful. And everyone's just pleased to see you even try, because they see you risking something and being vulnerable. They actually witness it with you. And the group done well. The group shares in that excitement and that visceral sense of being alive. And it was a really great reminder for me about the power of these small acts of courage, moment by moment. At the risk of being a bit long-winded, there's one other thing I wanted to add to this, because when I was thinking about what we were going to talking about, it made me go back to a great book from 20 or more years ago by an author called Richard Farson, who shared his research. He researched 2 groups of people. The first group he researched was he went to people and asked them about the moments when they sensed a shift, a positive shift in their relationship with their parent. What makes you think fondly of your father? And he discovered, and people would describe incidents to him, and it was always exceptions. It was when something odd happened, when my dad sat down with me in the backyard in his suit, having come straight from work, and ate dirty baked potatoes, because that's what I'd been baking in my childish way. Then he repeated this for people with, when were the moments when you decided you could trust your manager or your leader? And all the stories were exception stories, weird breaking, rule breaking, sharing of personal things. A boss arrives and cries because something's gone wrong at home, and the staff all gather around him. And from that point on, they feel much more close to the boss, because the boss didn't share a well-crafted story of vulnerability. The boss was vulnerable, perhaps almost despite themselves. And I think it's in those moments where we show our humanity. And I think it's often the small gestures. So when you actually are the thing you're talking about, because I think it's very easy to go to business school or go to an executive course and give a big speech about vulnerability. But I think it's the practice of it, the day-by-day practice of it, that I suspect either infuses or doesn't infuse organizations.
Do you see the, have you tried that exercise with, I'm just curious, with CEOs or senior executives? Are they able to make that transition to a more vulnerable state?
Good question. I'm pausing to answer, because the answer, in some ways, yes and no, because sometimes I don't take that risk. And in some contexts, you don't kind of have permission to be that playful with people, and you have to play a bit cautious, and you have to be quite subtle. But if I smell an opportunity to introduce an element of, I'm going to be honest about it, I think I want to call it kindly mischief, where you introduce a little bit of fun or challenge to see what you can provoke, or to notice these little moments in the conversations where a bit of humanity or warmth has come in, and pay attention to it and build it up. I mean, you talked about the work that we did. I kind of felt with you, Andrew, that there was an appetite for me to do something a little bit more risky. So we went full on, because you kind of egged me on, I think. So we played that game Bunny Bunny together, which is very playful. It involves we actually have to sing this song, which is a nonsense song in a way, and it's not really a song. It's a throwing of energy. I can't even do justice to it. I won't even try. But it involves a chorus.
To do that now.
It involves a lot of people going ooh ah together, and then bunny bunny together, and it's ludicrous and playful, and appears to be nonsensical. But it's a beautiful, viable way of connecting with our fellow workers. Now, in some contexts, that would be so uncomfortable that I wouldn't do it, because some people wouldn't like it. And, we've all seen The Office with Ricky Gervais doing really, really awful team building, and we don't want to go there. But when it's done artfully, and I hope I am doing it artfully, it actually creates all these very, I want to say, visceral connections, where we are not these little machines that are churning out facts and reports to each other. We're living, breathing human beings. We have arms and legs, and we move, and our voices have rising and falling tones and cadences, and there can be a musicality to the way we work together, which I think office life easily sort of drains down.
Well, it's kind of, I don't know, in my view, my experience, I mean, that is part of the role of a leader. And certainly as you go up the organization, more so. And if you don't have it, because a lot of people just don't have what Johnnie has. I mean, it's something that you have to learn, maybe try a few times, fail, and get better, better at it as you go along, get more comfortable, get out of that box and out of that skin, and but get closer to a style that can be what you're explaining, something that's more true, more authentic, more people, more human, because at the end of the day, I mean, that's what it's all about. It's not about numbers. It's about the people. And it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned, I'm jumping around a little bit, but there's a fantastic guy that I used to work for at FedEx, the chairman, Fred Smith. And his value statement proposition was around 3 terms: people, service, profit. And from the very, very beginning, he got that you had to be an authentic leader. You had to be true. You had to be honest. You had to practice integrity. You had to work hard at being a good leader. A great leader. It's not something you sort of put your clothes on every day and it just happens, because a lot of it you may not be comfortable with. But you've got to make sure you're giving that feedback, and that you're being empathetic, and you're being patient, and you're being transparent. And and you're engaging as you're supposed to be doing, and really making sure that you're doing all that you can so that the people are excited and inspired and able to chart a course in a way that makes sense. Only then can you think about any sort of service and customer experience, and let alone loyalty, and forget profitability. That's third in this equation. So yeah, it's really hard. It's not something that comes naturally. And that's why, as I look in the news over the last year, I mean, I think there must be many more, but, in my limited experience and exposure, I think I read two CEOs that really made a cracking commitment to stand behind their employees and their, and actually get to the point where they said, and it's also time to change our culture. The culture of this business needs to be much more responsive to the human side. And, we need to broaden our purpose from shareholder to include our stakeholders, which includes our employees. And so really a great rethink in terms of why we're here and making a commitment to that. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's much harder than it seems, but I would, as you would, I'm sure, like to challenge the business leaders today to really take this harder course, and to challenge themselves, and to be more courageous, and think about, is it time to think about how we do business differently in terms of what our purpose is, and how we run the business from a humanitarian standpoint.
Yeah, if it isn't hard, you're not doing it right.
Great, great.
And I think I find this personally quite helpful when I'm, confronting stresses and strains in my life, as I often am. It's very easy for me to get angry and bitter and resentful and cranky. And it's a relief to go, no, it's not meant to be easy. Life isn't meant to be that easy. It's a struggle. You actually have to bring your A game to this more of the time than you think in order to find it satisfying. And I think leaders need what they might need from someone who's kind of advising them or coaching them is an interesting blend, because I think they need to feel encouragement and support, but they also need to be provoked and challenged, and they need to be called and be good at calling people on bad behavior, and to find a way to do that well. I'm thinking, as you were talking, Andrew, I found myself remembering a team that I worked with in the past, where I was working with a management team. The leader was a very impressive guy, very talented. They were doing pretty well, but they sensed that they were not really firing as a team. They weren't what I would call an ensemble team. They weren't like a really great team. They were a polite team, and it wasn't really working, and there were stresses and strains. And we had several sessions where we talked about it, and we talked in generalities about values and the importance of teamwork, and we all agreed it was important, and they would say that it was going quite well. And I gradually started to realize there's something missing here, and there's no grit in this. And I started fishing for what isn't working. And then they would talk in more generalities. And they would often say, when I asked what wasn't working, they would often go, well, no, we're actually quite a good team, but sometimes we're not well coordinated. And I would drill down patiently. Yeah. And I think this is the subtlety I'm talking about. I didn't go at them hard, but I patiently kept saying, yeah, but I'm looking for a specific example. Can anyone give me a specific instance, say, within the team where you haven't felt happy? And eventually they started to share apparently these quite small frustrations, and they started, we worked on it, and they started to share them in quite down-to-earth ways. And it was stuff like, it wasn't, well, I feel like our strategic vision hasn't reached the touch points of our brand values. It was, when you didn't reply to that email for 3 days, it made my life really hard. And next time, could you reply quickly? And to say that was a risk. That was as scary as my improv class. To be the first person to state a complaint specifically to a specific person about something they'd done, rather than talk about the importance of punctuality, which just leaves me going, I don't know what that means. Now, the ground didn't swallow either person up, because the person complained to, in those comments, they usually said, oh, you're right, and I did feel bad about it, and I will be better next time. And if you could feel like, now those two people were suddenly closer to each other in a way they weren't before. And they didn't know they weren't until they didn't know there was a block until they cleared it. And the clearing of the small complaints created this different sense, and you could feel it. It's not something you'd write about it. You could just feel that, oh, well, now we are more like, I think of a band where the instruments are suddenly a bit more in time with each other. Now, the interesting thing about that work was the KPI for that, if you like, was a couple of sessions later, I said, how's it going? And they said 3 of these 7 people said, well, do you know what I've noticed is my relationship with my wife is just a whole lot better now.
Wow.
Because some of this emotional, I call it emotional debt, because they'd paid off some emotional debt by taking the courage to be honest with each other, had created all this power. And actually all of the other issues they thought they had, all the technical gremlins in the app and the app, those all things seem to start to solve themselves. So I think the hard work is not like the big decisive action, right? It's not necessarily giving a speech or harshly admonishing hundreds of staff. It might be, have you told your nearest co-worker something that they're doing that's annoying you in a way that allows them to respond humanly? And I think the practice of multiple acts of that kind of honesty might be what people most need help with and support with and encouragement to do.
That's great. I love that. I love that. You know, some believe that this COVID crisis will actually accelerate the movement toward the necessary refoundation of business and capitalism around purpose and humanity. That this is the moment that we've been waiting for, in a sense. This is the big change moment. Have you witnessed this as you've worked with clients? And if so, I mean, has it been more notable across industry or country? Are you seeing this
Um,
change or not
so,
really?
so the short answer, because I'm giving you long answers, Andrew, today. So the short answer is yes. Then the slightly longer answer is, I suppose what for me is often more useful than making predictions about whether things are going to change is to own what do I want. And I know what this crisis has done for me. It's made me more keen to see change, more passionate about it. And I think, maybe that gives me filters, but I'm seeing all sorts of evidence of it. Now, I'm sure there were some people who want to go back to what we had before, but I think a lot of people have been kind of woken up by this pandemic to the pointlessness of what they were doing before, and my hunger for more meaningful work and relationships has been activated. And I'm pretty sure it's happening for, if not for everyone, then for a lot of people, that we don't want to go back to the, I would say, the kind of slightly mindless level of consumption that we were doing. And I would like to be part of building a more humane, imaginative way of working. And I think the old system has been creaking for a long time. And I don't know whether this jolt to it will be the thing that does it, because if this jolt doesn't, then it's going to need a bigger jolt. And I'd sooner start now than wait for the climate change jolts to start.
That's right, exactly.
Destabilizing what we're doing.
I'm curious, in your work around the world, are you able to give an example of a leader, maybe a senior executive that really stands out, who demonstrated this mindset of repurposing the business and creating more humanity into how we execute the business? Have you actually worked with someone like that, and how do they exhibit those behaviors to you?
I noticed that I immediately think of two or three people that I can think of, and I'm not gonna be too specific about them.
That's fine.
And they're not heroic leaders, but they've done these. I always think of these persistent. What would we call it? These persistent minor acts of courage and bravery and heroism, and they've not always been the top person in their organization. In fact, and I think this is interesting, they've often been working in organizations that are a little bit toxic, actually, but their bit of the organization isn't. And I think this is very important, because I think it's very easy to think, yes, well, if I were working in a better company, I could do it. But no, this is hard. You have to do it in the company that you're in for the time being. So I know someone who worked with one of the humanitarian organizations I work with, who was just a very brave, honest, passionate, committed guy who really had a twinkle in his eye. He loved the work he was doing. He strongly believed in what he was doing. He always advocated for his way of doing it, which involved a much more humane, a much more experimental, a mode of which I think is hugely important. He seemed to really think learning was incredibly important. He wanted everyone to be learning, not him teaching, but to be in an atmosphere in which everyone was learning. Now, his higher boss was quite an old-fashioned, hierarchical, and not, to be very honest about it, not very nice guy. But the hero just kept on anyway and didn't somehow get too distracted by some of the toxic stuff in the organization, just kept working away at what he could do. And the others I'm thinking of, they all, for me, had this resilience, if you like. So not resilience as in I'm super strong, but a willingness to be hurt and carry on and sort of be reasonably calm in their reaction to adversity, and to get back in the game sooner and just be the person that people cared for, cared about, kind of loved, I guess, and trusted. And it sounds, Andrew, like you did work for someone, right? Fred Smith sounds like he does live up to the billing.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would say 9 out of 10 have not. But so it's exceptional. It really is exceptional, which is it's dumbfounding. I mean, I don't really understand. The only thing, I'm not a psychologist. What I bring, maybe you can clarify. What I bring it down to is, it's way beyond skill or any training. Or even experience. It's much deeper than that. I mean, you almost need a mindset. It's almost a part of the DNA DNA construct that affects someone's ability to be proactive in these areas, let alone sort of have the courage to go about doing it, and then doing it so well. And when you hear these gentlemen, and there is actually an article that I'll put in the description that we referenced in putting together this podcast. The former CEO of Best Buy, I believe it was, he talked very openly and very clearly about how to create, resense, repurpose a business in the right sense, and making it much more of a human experience. It's something that seems to be fairly natural, which calls out another concern that I have also for the HR area, because that's where I've spent a lot of my career, that in these strategic roles, as we go forward, increasingly we need to look beyond experience and just skills per se. We need to be able to we need to look the extra mile and make sure that we're getting people into these roles that have this DNA as well. Because I think to be successful and to be really truly effective, it takes a lot more. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I think this is incredibly interesting, Andrew, because I think there's a nice, interesting, paradoxical path, and I don't know if I can articulate it, because you talked about it being in the DNA and it being a deep characteristic, and I think I agree with it. And I also want to say that I think I maybe I'm an idealist, but I think most of us actually have the capacity to be good at this, but we're not going to get it through conventional training. So I want to say I think it can be discovered or it can be uncovered. I'm not sure it can be taught. And I think you mentioned HR, I think so if I think about the toxic leader that I alluded to, for whom my heroic person worked, he'd been on a lot of training. So he was saying a lot of the right things. He gave very polished town hall performances. He was very good at, I've seen this. He was very good at, he did all the tricks. So when he gave his annual speech, he gave amusing anecdotes by first name for all the team. And so Frank, funny story. And we all laughed. And he was doing all the right things. And yet I even now, my buttocks are clenching as I think about him, because I just felt, I don't like you. I don't know why. I don't like you. I don't trust you. I can see you've done the training. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you've done what you've been trained to do. So you are a skilled and polished leader, but there's something missing. And it fell out. My instinct was right. You could just see in his micro behaviors that he was not a friendly person. He was quite harsh and controlling. He wasn't living out. He certainly wasn't living the dream. It was fake. Now, I think that what my work, I guess, is partly about is helping people to uncover this talent for connection and vulnerability. And you often have to kind of play a little to find it. You have to experiment to find people's capacity to relate authentically. But I passionately believe that most of us still have it. And it might be well covered up because of the adversities of our life and our education system, and we might have lost it. But we had it as, I don't want to be idealistic, but we had it as kids, and somehow it got trained out of us. And I maybe what gets me excited is reminding myself to do it, to bring my A game to it, to bring my more playful, creative energies to thing, and encourage others to do so too, so not to be stuck. So I want to say it's hard, but hey, let's all try, because it's so joyful when we can do it.
Well, I think that's great. That's a very positive message. I don't want to paint a negative message. I think there's a lot of, hardworking people out there doing the best they can, and doing their job very well.
Yeah,
I think we could take it a step further, and I think we might have to, if we're going to be able to achieve this broader sense of, purpose and humanity in organizations. Um, and maybe, maybe Johnnie, I kind of believe this, just from my own experience. If you are shown, and if the person above you demonstrates and sets the example and gives you feedback and coaches you and recognizes you and rewards you and shows you, right? It's a lot easier. I mean, in terms
Yep.
of understanding, oh, I see why this is important. Oh, I see how to do this.
Yep.
Oh, and so it really starts with our CEO is a key player in this. I think the CEO is where, it needs to start. And then he or she needs to put people in to that C-suite that get it too. They've not just been to the training, but they have demonstrated, they have a proven track record of being able to follow suit. And that could be just being open enough to follow the CEO. And then,
Yeah.
all the way down the organization. But I think that CEO and maybe the CHRO is also a key player in this, in really helping to set the example for others to follow. I don't know. It's just because, if you try to drive these sorts of behaviors within the organization, it's very difficult and very short term.
Yeah.
You've got to be empowered to do this. Which is when, where you come in. I mean, this is where a lot of your coaching and work takes place. So here's a little tricky one. So as you're talking to the business leaders out there listening to this podcast, how would you explain then, okay, if this is important, the link between purpose and humanity in business with my competitive advantage, the sustainability of my business, and sort of the managing expectations of shareholders and stakeholders during this crisis and beyond. So it's kind of a mouthful, but in your words, how would you explain sort of the value proposition here?
Wow. Big question. Let me try and attach it in small bites. First thing, I want to mention an article by, I'm not sure I'm going to get the name right, so if it's all right, I may add this to the links that you put in the chat. I think it was in the Harvard Business Review, and it talks about the difference between vision and holding in a leader. And I thought it was, he wrote it in the context of the pandemic, and I thought it's a good, and it's an academically quite solid article about how many leaders respond to crisis by talking about how we're going, the future, that we're going to come out of this stronger. And he said, but actually what's more useful, especially in crisis, for a leader to do is to hold people. And he expands on what he means by that. It's a great article because he understands this in depth. And he talks about, that's about what we're talking about, giving a people a sense of safety, letting them know that you care, and demonstrating that you care, and kind of creating I want to use the word, this performance of, I don't mean performance in a fake way, I mean performance as in you are putting some energy into it and you're taking some personal risks to do this, to create a sense of care and warmth and vulnerability. So, and the crudest answer to that is you have to kind of be the change that you want to see in the world. And then I think part of what I also think our conversation is about, it reminds me of some of the work by Robert Keegan, who talks about the incredible value of creating a sense for people that they are learning when they're at work. And I'm paraphrasing a bit, but if you have a team where people are making discoveries about themselves every day, they're going to stick around, and they're going to be less likely to take the extra 10 grand to go and work for your competitor, because they might be jeopardizing this exciting atmosphere in which they're being developed. And that's why when you were talking about the importance of coaching, that's why it's so important. It's not just about getting people to do a better job. It's about giving them a reason to stick around because they want to be around this environment where they're getting that really rare thing, really useful, creative, imaginative feedback, not your standard performance review 4 out of 10, but like, hey, when you did that, that was really interesting. Or, hey, that was good, but could you try it this way? That kind of, and I almost don't want to call it coaching because coaching is such a cliched phrase, but that kind of care and attention, that kind of, really good parenting type relationship stuff, that's I guess the thing that's the performance of leadership that I'm kind of excited about encouraging people to give. And I kind of want to restate that they often don't realize that they have it in them. Some of the most satisfying work for me is where someone talks about a difficult relationship, talks about how they are in it, and I kind of help them try something new, bring some other performance of themselves to it, that they suddenly discover, oh, it works better when I do it this way. And they didn't even know they had it in them.
Hmm. Well, that sounds like a pretty fun type of organization. I think, when you think about, I personally, I think, having a purpose-led organization, one that is, more humanly based, that really emphasizes this notion of humanity. I mean, do you think it's in line with the new generation?
So
in terms of
think
expectations of workforces? Go ahead.
I would hope so. I mean, I'm getting old these days, so I'm no expert on the new generation, and I'm very optimistic about them. But maybe I'm deluded. But I think the thing about purpose is, I think we have to be a little imaginative about it, because if I think of, let's say, a big supermarket chain, this is always the example that comes to mind. They might have some purpose of feeding the world and quality. We can imagine what their purpose might be. But that probably doesn't matter enormously to the part-time checkout worker. That's not the role of Sainsbury's or Asda for them. The role of that is it's a safe job that gives them the extra money to pay for some treats or to feed their kids or something like that. And they don't have to buy into the high. They're probably not against the higher purpose, but that's not their motivation. And we don't need them to. And we don't really want to make them pay lip service to the company song and the company mission. If they're doing a great job and they're probably friendly. One of my friends is one of these workers, and her passion is cycling. And I don't need her to pretend to be passionate about food. She'll turn up and she'll do a great job with commitment and passion and heart. And she was on those checkouts during COVID, so she was an essential worker. So I think we have to be kind and generous in how we think about purpose. And sometimes I think we have to think about meaning, that the job has meaning, that job has meaning for her. It fits into her life. She's doing it because she has to, but she makes it meaningful to her in her way. And I think we need our purpose not to become some kind of slavish pretense.
Yeah.
If you're a barista in a coffee shop, you don't have to pretend to be passionate about coffee. But you might be passionate about your co-workers, and you need to feel that this is a place. I come back to this. If this is a place where you're treated well, you're treated kindly, and you feel like you belong, and your boss isn't horrible, and there's some joy and learning and fun in all of it, that's good enough. And I think good enough is a really powerful concept, because the leaders are under this pressure to be the ideal, the Harvard Business School ideal of you've got to be all these things. Well, it's more than any of us can manage. I have lots of off days and days when I behave very crankily to people that I wouldn't want people witnessing this video to know about, but here I am telling you about them. So there's something about being good enough and not having, because I think some of these missions, purpose statements are so idealized that we all just drift off and go, oh, I don't really, yeah, sure, I agree with that. What does that really mean? So I think you've got to allow some flesh, some color, some humanity into the way you describe these things.
Cool. Yeah, it's almost like, I mean, in a sense, I mean, I know there's a lot of literature out there as of late, including in this article that I referenced earlier that we'll share about this need for purpose and humanity, and totally agree. But don't you think it's always been there? It's not COVID that's brought this about. I think any great organization, and indeed any great leader, whether they are head of government or organization, company, I mean, they need to create they need to sort of cultivate a purpose that has meaning beyond just the bottom line, so that people can aspire to that and be inspired by that, and that they can use to aspire and inspire their customer base, to basically, generate that level of motivation and incentive and excitement and loyalty. I think it's good practice anyway. And then the humanity is another one. I think it's, we've always been a bunch of people. To call it an organization, non-for-profit or for-profit or governmental, whatever it is, but it's made up of people, and people are fairly simple. They've got some basic requirements. If you respect them and you respect how they, their needs, the outcome is just much stronger. I think, COVID and, when we get into these extreme scenarios, these sort of notions are brought back out of the woodwork. But I think it's always been there. I think, if you're going to be a great leader in any sort of organization, this is something you've got to understand and make sure that you can practice, because at the end of the day, it will make all of the difference in terms of the level of engagement that you're able to build in the organization. And only when you have that engagement, this, guys, and girls, that's when you get the performance that you need, and that's when you get the service and the customer loyalty and so on.
Yeah.
So I think it's always been a critical requirement, don't you think?
I think there are. Yeah, I think there have always been beautiful businesses, and some of them are vulnerable. They don't last forever. If you're going to do something genuinely beautiful, you have to carry the risk that it might fail. But as you were talking, I was thinking of my friend Alan Moore has written a book about beautiful business, and he's just written a new book about how to build one. And he's got wonderful, loads and loads of stories of really beautiful, I keep using his word, beautiful businesses, that some of which have been around for a long time, with wonderful stories about how they put their staff first. And again, it's tiny incidental bits of behavior that make a place attractive. So there's a gelato shop in Cambridge, one in particular that I remember a year or two ago during the winter, I walked by, it was closed, and there was a sign on the door. And it said, "Oh, we've gone off on a long holiday to go and find other ice cream flavors around the world." And I was expecting it to end with a promise for when they were back, but it didn't say when. They just said for a few weeks. And I thought that totally breaks the correct model, right? Which is, you should be customer centric. You should tell me when you're coming. But actually, I love that they didn't, because it conveyed to me he was playful, he was having fun, he was interested. I'm sure he wasn't just researching flavors. I'm sure he was having a nice break in the sun. But I kind of like that vibe of, I'm not so desperate that I'm going to tell you when I'm going to come back. So it can often manifest in quite eccentric ways. But I think we are very intelligent people. I think we make big meanings out of small signals, not always the same meaning. And I think a beautiful business is willing to credit its customers and its stakeholders with enough intelligence, not to sort of specify everything to the last detail, but to trust to a bit of eccentricity. And I'm going to keep coming to that word, beauty. Alan has sort of banged on about it for several years. I'm going to get the hang of it. That I think we have to take, and we're back to our conversation about risks and vulnerability and being willing to stick your neck out for things that you genuinely care about, and not just follow a formula, because you can't do this by just following a formula. If you could, we'd all be doing it. Yeah,
exactly. It's definitely a lot harder than it looks. And I do think that beyond COVID, I think the markets are rapidly changing. It really doesn't matter what industry you're in. Everyone's trying to figure out the future, right? It really is a mad race at the moment. And I think, as a leader, it is definitely worthwhile, thinking about this notion strategically, because, doing what you've said, I mean, has, as a simple example, and I love that ice cream store example, can be a great differentiator, And that can allow you to attract the talent, keep the talent, attract the customers, in this world that's constantly changing.
Yes.
You will differentiate yourself, which is so cool.
Yeah. Right? Well, there's that ancient cliched thing about crisis as opportunity, which I always find a little bit tedious, right? But in a way, the absolute levels of madness, is that the word? Chaos,
Mm.
uncertainty that we've been living with at a high level for a whole year now. I think I've had conversations with people where, they have the capacity to do something brave, but haven't quite got there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes what tips the balance of it is to go, look, one of the upsides of living with so much anxiety and uncertainty is your safe conventional route isn't safe anymore. So, hey, why not take the risk of doing something you really care about?
Yeah.
Because you might as well, because the safe, boring routes don't look that safe anymore. So why not take the risk of saying what you really believe, doing what you really care about? Why not err on the side of adventure? Maybe this is the best time, because we sure need it. I think I know many people who are, we're kind of hungry for something better than what we've got. I think the old late stage capitalism really does look creaky after a year of this. It's like those priorities were in the right place. I don't want to go back to endless consumption. That wasn't very satisfying. I've been quite happy consuming a lot less.
Great point. Yeah.
So maybe we should start taking risks on the side of some optimism, acted out in our behavior, not just hoping, but actually acting optimistically. That's another big and deep question. I find myself thinking about some of the work I've done. I'm very lucky to have a part-time role at the Oxford Business School, which runs a really interesting leadership program. And I think it's called the Strategic Leadership Program, which in some ways is a very misleading description, unless you're open to a very different idea of what strategy is. And that program, I've been on it, I've only helped out for the last 3 or 4 years, but over the last 40 years, it's actually become increasingly humanistic and humanitarian in its content. Less, I don't say less science, but less mediocre science, if you like, and more beautiful art. So they bring in, Richard Olivier, who's a very talented guy with a theatre background, to use Shakespeare as a metaphor for leadership. And it explores leadership in this much more organic way, where they bring in a conductor of a choir to get people to conduct a choir as a way of exploring what leadership is, which is a fantastic experience and a real mind bender, in which you realize that your gestures and the spirit and animation you bring to your role is more important than your clever thinking. So my sense is we've got to become, and I don't want to say this in a way that makes this out I think it's within all our reach to be just better at being a more full-blooded human being, and to get out of the trances that we easily fall into, which I think tend to make us a bit limited in our vision and probably a bit mean with others, and discover ways to be more generous and, I'm going to risk saying, playful in the way, experimental, imaginative in the way that we work with people. Sensing their possibility as fellow human beings.
That's great. That's great. And empowering those that maybe work with you or for you to do the same.
Yeah.
Just be yourself, have some fun, be human, be creative. So I love that. I mean, that's just, wonderful. Okay, well, listen, I mean, I could spend all day. I know we could spend the day together. I always love to do that. But if I could just ask one last question, I think it's important just to reflect on, lastly, what would you say are the risks to organization and businesses if they fail to align their reason for being by defining it around purpose and humanity? How would you describe the risks?
Oh, I think they risk being doomed. I don't think there's any. I mean, I'm quite confident of that. I'm not sure when it will happen. They might get away with it for quite a lot longer, but what they're risking is total sudden collapse. I think of the Berlin Wall. That looked very solid through my early adult life. I assumed it was always going to be there, and then it vanished. I'm sure it took a year. Kind of overnight, the entire system collapsed. And the history of it and the detail of the history is fascinating, but it all just completely collapsed because it was the massive lie had been successfully perpetuated by a kind of authoritarian regime. And if you aren't human, if you have an organization made up of these extraordinary biological creatures with arms and legs and these organs and viscera and brains that we don't fully understand, these extraordinary things that are not computers, and you run them in an inhuman way, in the end, that has to collapse, and possibly violently. And you, if you're the leader of it, you might find that has quite personal adverse consequences. So that's what happens, is eventually it catches up. I mean, that's I think what history shows. These things rise and then they collapse. So I think that's the downside of trying to stick to the old system.
Yes, and I think there must be a relationship too with, I mean, obviously, you know, as things speed up, being attractive as an employer, but, you know, even beyond that, you know, having a strong employer value proposition that the market recognizes. Like in the UK, you've got what is it? Not employer of choice. I forget what that national certification of achievement against investors and people. Have here. But, you know, beyond that, you know, how customers live the experience, the service experience and the product experience, you know, how decisions are made, how teams thoughtfully collaborate. I think how innovation is spurred. I mean, all of that also, I mean, it seems that there is so much that emanates from having this purpose in humanity in the right place. When humans are happier, don't they do greater things?
Yeah. I mean, we all know this is true, right? We all know this is true. And I think we have, to some degree or other, bought, I know I have at times, for quite kind of inadvertently bought into the lie that it's not, that it isn't true, and that we actually have to fight. And I know in my life that's made me very, very miserable. And then I probably spread that misery, right? But we all see small kids playing. We know that we have it in us. I don't want to idealize the small kids. I see it in adults. I see it in old people. Yeah. That capacity to bring out a spark. Go to a great show. Go and watch a really fabulous Broadway or off-Broadway or amateur show. I can think of some fabulous productions I've been to, and you know the magic that those things create. And I don't suppose a burger bar could create that magic, because it's a burger bar or a coffee shop. It's not a thing. But that kind of human spark magic and aliveness, yes, of course we have that. That's innate in us. That's you can see it through our performing arts and through organizing life. That is possible. I'm getting a little hype now. I've had too much coffee probably, but we all know that we can do it. Yeah. Most of us needed a bit of encouragement to give it a go.
Well, Johnnie, I think this is a great lesson for the leaders out there that want to know how they can make a bigger difference. I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today. And before we close today, do you have anything you'd like to sort of add on the tail end of this?
Actually, the thing that comes to mind is I want to say thanks for. I find this really fun to do. I like talking about my work. I struggle with describing it when I have to write it on my own. And I was thinking how much more fun it is for me to try to talk to someone and kick ideas around with someone and express it conversationally. And that might be a clue in there related to the theme, which is not to write too many big documents and actually do more talking to people, be in conversation, which I think has an Italian root, which is to dance together, conversare, I think it is. Yeah. I might be horribly wrong here. Forgive me if I am. But like to be in a live exchange as we have been is enlivening. I mean, I think my energy level is quite high compared to how I was when I started. So thank you.
Fantastic. Johnnie, thank you so much. Huh?
You're welcome.
We'll talk to you soon. You take care.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Johnnie, for sharing your immense experience in this area. Really appreciate it. No doubt you'll be helping leaders and others better understand the importance of defining a business reason for being around purpose and humanity. The link to competitive advantage and managing shareholders and stakeholders across a crisis and beyond. If you want to reach out to Johnnie, check him out on LinkedIn or at his company website, JohnnieMoore.com. Thanks everyone for joining us. Tune in next time for another Talent Miners podcast. Have a great day.